Hello and welcome to Celtic Knitted Designs. In today's video I'm going to teach you how to knit for absolute beginners, so if you've never picked up knitting needles before, don't have a clue what you're doing, this video is for you. If you're new to this channel, welcome. At Celtic Knitted Designs we produce videos on knitting projects and knitting techniques, so be sure to hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon so you get a notification every time we post something new. Now, on with knitting. Okay, so first things first, when you're learning to knit, you need yarn and knitting needles. These are Pony 10mm knitting needles. Now, when everyone refers to the size, you can see it at the top of the needle here. What it's actually referring to is the diameter of the needle itself. And this is important because the knitting needle size needs to correspond with the type of wool you're using. So by that I mean, big knitting needles, like these, need big yarn. Like this, where you've got really thick yarn, you need to have a corresponding needle size. Now, if you're struggling to know which size to use, have a look at the band and it will suggest a needle size or a crochet hook size, but because we're knitting, we're going to look at the knitting needles. So you can see there, you've got crossed over knitting needles, and underneath it says 10mm or US 15. So in the US, there's slightly different sizing, but we're going to use British, so 10mm knitting needles. So this corresponds with this. Now, obviously, if your yarn is thinner, like this, you use smaller needles. So these are 3.25mm needles, much thinner than those size 10. So you get different types of weight of yarn, and by weight it means how thick the strand of yarn actually is that you're going to be knitting with. And that's what corresponds with your knitting needle size. You get lots of different weights. They start from lace weight and 4-ply. Then there's sock yarn, sport yarn, and this is double knitting. You also get Aran weight yarn, which is this, which is really commonly used in knitting patterns for jumpers and sweatshirts. And that has a corresponding needle size that's a bit thicker because the yarn's thicker. So that's Aran weight. It's also called worsted weight. Then you go up to chunky size yarn. So it's a bit thicker again. And then we're back up to this first size that I showed you, which is called super chunky or super bulky. This is the thickest common size yarn, but you also get arm knitting yarn, which is huge and doesn't really require any needles. So this is what we're going to be using today. The reason we're using this yarn is because this is what I recommend to all my beginners, because your project will grow really quick. So this is King Cole Big Value Super Chunky in this nice mauve pinky lilac-y colour. It's 100% acrylic, which is also good for beginners. It's a little bit cheaper than most yarn, which is also good for when you're starting off, because if you're practicing, it doesn't matter. You don't want to be using really expensive yarn that you're going to do some swatches and squares with. For beginners, I do recommend plastic needles. Again, they're cheaper, but they also provide a little bit of a grip. And if you want to know more about different types of knitting needles, then check out my video that's just on that. So when you're knitting, you're basically passing stitches from one needle to the next. And by doing so, you're growing the project widthways, and it kind of goes up and up. But the first thing you have to be able to do is get the stitches or the yarn onto the needles. Now this sounds kind of scary, but I'm going to take you through step by step and show you exactly what you need to do. So getting some wool onto the needles is called casting on. Sometimes referred to as cast on or bind on, but we're going to say casting on, so cast on. Okay, so to cast on, the first thing you have to do is make a slip knot. Now you don't need to be a Boy Scout or anything like that. I'll show you the method that I use, which I find really easy to remember. So what I'm going to do is take the yarn. I've got the tail end, which means there's nothing else, it's the end of the yarn, and the ball end, which is the end that's still got a ball of yarn attached to it. Sometimes that's called the working end. So we've got a little bit of a tail, not much, and we're going to drape the yarn like this over our index and forefinger on our right hand. And then I'm going to take the tail end and bring it to the front. Then what I'm going to do is cross it over like this. So whilst the palm of my hand's still facing me. And then I'm going to turn my fingers so that the backs of them are now facing me. Then this rear strand, which is our tail end, I'm going to pass under this front strand that's towards my nails. So it's going to go under there, and I'm going to pull that bit up and pull that strand through. And then keep pull down on the ball end of the yarn. And then you can see you have a loop at the top here, and that's your slip knot. And what we're going to do now is take our knitting needle and pass it through that loop, like so, and then pull the tail and the ball end just to secure it onto the needle. And there we go, we have cast on, we've made our slip knot, and this counts as our very first stitch, which is great. So if you need to see that again, just take your time. This is probably one of the trickiest bits to knitting, so once you get this down, you're absolutely bossing it. Okay, so now that we've got that first stitch on, we need to get some more stitches onto the needle so that we can start knitting. Now, the next step's really a lot easier because we've done the hard work with the slip knot. So what I'm going to do is the ball end of the yarn, there's my tail end dangling down there, we're just going to ignore that. We're going to pick up the ball end of the yarn with our left hand. We're then going to stick our grip that yarn and stick your thumb up like you're giving somebody the thumbs up. I'm then going to put my thumb to the back of that yarn and bring it to the front and scoop the yarn up. And then going to take the tip of the needle and go into the base here where you can see the two strands cross over. You see that? It's making a bit of a triangle at the base of my thumb. So the knitting needle is going to go up from the bottom into that triangle, and then I'm going to slide my thumb out and just slightly pull on the working end of the yarn at the same time. And that's you cast on another stitch. So that's 2 stitches now on the needle. And then we're just going to repeat that. So grip the ball end of the yarn with your fingers of your left hand, thumb up. We're going to go to the back and scoop that working yarn up. Then the needle tip is going to go into the base of the thumb from the bottom up where we've got that triangle. And we're going to slide our thumb out whilst tugging on the working end of the yarn with our fingers in our left hand. And we've now got 3 stitches cast on. And we'll do that again. So grip the yarn, working end of the yarn with your left hand, left thumbs up, goes to the back, brings it to the front and scoops that yarn up, creates a triangle at the base of your thumb, and your needle's going to go in from the bottom into that triangle, push the needle up, slide your thumb out and pull the working yarn with your left hand. Now what's tempting to do is pull that working yarn really tight. You can keep going and keep going and keep going, but don't do that. Try and keep it loose so that you can actually move the stitches on the needle, because that'll make the next step much easier. And this is often called your tension. So how tight you pull your stitches or how tight you knit your stitches are this thing called tension. So people refer to that, and that's how you create a neat finish to your knitting, but also a uniform pattern. So it is really important, and all that you can do to improve tension is to keep practicing. So we're going to keep on casting on. We've got 4 stitches on here now. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to grab the working end of the yarn with our left hand, thumb up, scoop round, cross over, needle goes in the tip, the base, pull that out, and just keep going. Thumb up, scoop, and out. Thumb up, scoop, and out. 4, 6, 8, 10. Going to do a couple more. There we go. So now we're going to count how many stitches I've got on the needle. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 stitches on there. And now you can see if you hold that horizontally, we've got our tail end here where we did our slip knot. And then we've got this nice little ridge along the bottom, and that's where we've cast on our stitches. And the method there that I just shown you with the left thumb and doing the thumbs up is called the thumb method. It's one of the easier ways of casting on, and it's definitely one of my preferred methods. So now that we've got our 14 stitches on the needle, we are going to start to knit. This is all very exciting. So what we're going to do is put this needle with all these cast on stitches into our left hand. Now you can see we've got the working end of the yarn at the top, ready to go. We've got the tail end down here. Again, remember to ignore the tail end. And we've got all our stitches. Now it's time to grab your second needle. Now the empty needle is going to go in your right hand. And we are now going to do the knit stitch. Now to knit, what you're doing is picking up each of these stitches, wrapping the yarn round and putting it onto this empty needle. And this process builds up the work, and that's basically how you knit. It's just formulation of these stitches. So to do the knit stitch, we're going to take our right needle and we're going to put it in the base of this first stitch. So it's coming in from the bottom and we're going to push it through. Can you see it there? And so it's going from the front at the bottom to the back. And now what we've got is the left needles to the front, the empty right needles at the back, and they've crisscrossed, so they're crossing each other. We've got the working end of the yarn at the back here. And what we're going to do is pick that up with our right hand, and we're going to wrap that round the back of that right needle and in between the two needles. So it's coming there. So we've gone round the back and in between the two. So then we're going to tug down on that lightly, and at the same time pull the right needle down and bring it to the front while scooping up that stitch that's on your left needle like that. And then the last step is to slide it off the left needle. And there we go, we have one stitch now on the right needle, and that is a knit stitch. So I'm going to show you that all over again in super slow motion. So we've got our working yarn at the back, and we're going to take our right needle, which now has one stitch on it, and we're going to go into the bottom of this stitch that's at the top of the left needle. So it's going to go into the bottom and find the little gap and cross the two stitches over, two needles over. So we now have the left needle to the front, the right to the back. We're going to take the working yarn, wrap it around the back of the right needle, in between the two needles, tug it down slightly, and we're going to slide that right needle down and pull it through here, and then slide the stitch off the left needle. So we now have two stitches on our right needle. Okay, let's do that again. We are going to take our right needle, we're going to go into the base of this stitch on the left needle, and we're going to find that gap at the bottom and cross our knitting needles over. Then I'm going to take our working end and go around the back of the right needle, in between the two needles, pull it down slightly whilst guiding our right needle down through there, picking up that stitch and sliding it off. And so we've now knitted 3 stitches. And this is a knit stitch. So we're just going to continue like that. Into the bottom, wrap the yarn round, slide the right needle down, up and off. Into the bottom, wrap the yarn round, going down, over and off. And again, into the bottom, wrap the yarn round, going down, over and off. And we just keep repeating that. Into the bottom, wrap the yarn round, and down, over and off. Into the bottom, wrap the yarn round, down, over and off. And now we are at the last stitch on the left needle, and we've got all these lovely stitches on the right. What we're going to do is the exact same thing. We are just going to go into the bottom of that stitch, ignore the tail end, wrap the working yarn around the back of the right needle, in between the two, bring the right needle down, over and off. And there we go. We have now knitted our very first row of knitting. Amazing. Okay, so what we're going to do now is all those stitches from our right needle, now we switch hands and they go into our left, the empty needle comes back to our right. And what you can see is we've got this nice ridge of stitches. If yours looks a bit like this, where you can see some stitches clearly, but then you can see the ridge, just straighten it up, because that's it just twisting round. And if you do that, it just helps you keep to a good tension, but also stops you from getting confused. So just keep that ridge to the bottom and it will make things a lot easier. So now you need to be careful. We're about to do row 2. And what you can see is we've got the tail end here and the working end. The working end is obviously the one that's attached to the ball of yarn. So what to be careful of is make sure you're going to use the working end and not the tail end for this next bit. So what we're going to do now is knit another row of stitches. So we've got our working yarn in our right hand. We're going to take our right needle that's empty, go into that first stitch on the left needle, into the bottom again, cross the needles over, working yarn goes round the back, in between the two, goes up, over, and slide it off. And there we go. And we're just going to work the knit stitch into each one till we get to the end. Okay, so we've got to the end of our second row, and now we're going to switch hands again. So all the needle with all the stitches on goes to our left hand, empty needle into our right, and then we are ready to knit our third row. And as you can see, it's really starting to grow, and this is why I recommend super chunky yarn and quite big needles. One, it's easier to see what you're doing, but it also grows really quickly, so you can actually see a bit of progress, which is super satisfying and what you really need as a beginner. So we're going to knit this third row. So we're going into the bottom again, working yarn, round the back, in between the two needles, up, over, and slide it off. Now, always remember to do the sliding off bit, because I remember when I was first learning to knit, I always forgot to slide off, and you can tell if you haven't, because you'll have more stitches on your needle all of a sudden. You'll be like, what? I started off with 14 and now I've got 15. It might be because you've done that, but don't worry about it. Just keep practicing, and that's the best way to improve. So there's 2, And we just keep going along there. Okay, so that was the end of row 3. We switched our needles across again. And now what I'm going to do is just keep on knitting every row until I've got a bit more of a swatch to show you. So keep on knitting. Okay, so I'm now on row 10. Just going to keep knitting these stitches. And as you can see, as you keep going back and forth, that's called, each one of those is called a row, and that's how your piece grows. Get to the end of there and switch round. And there we go. So this is the typical knit stitch. By knitting every stitch like this, this forms something that's called the garter stitch. It's pretty common in a lot of knitted garments, and it just looks really nice and cozy. But you can see it growing quite nicely. And as you can see, it's a pretty good shout to go for these big needles and the super chunky yarn, because we're seeing it grow so fast. When I was saying about the different types of stitches, check out my other videos that are on that, because they explain the purl stitch. When I first heard of the purl stitch, I thought it was like as in the gem that you get inside an oyster, but no, it's P-U-R-L, purl. And that's very similar to the knit stitch, but you're coming into the front. So there's more information on that, but I do recommend it as an absolute beginner. The first thing you do is just keep practicing the knit stitch, so you can work on your tension, get it really neat and get really confident in it, and always make sure that you've got the same amount of stitches on your needle as what you cast on, so that then you're not accidentally adding stitches or dropping stitches. So if you see a hole suddenly appear, you may have dropped a stitch, which means you didn't knit it, so it's unraveled and left a hole in your work. But don't worry, just keep practicing doing those swatches and little patches like this, and you are well on your way to becoming a knitter. Now, the last thing to bear in mind is that we've got all these stitches on the needle, and you then need to get them off. Now that's called casting off or cast off. It's also called binding off or bind off. And that is how you get the stitches off the needle. And as you can imagine, you shouldn't just pull them off the needle, because that will unravel the whole work. It's a way in which you get the stitches off and leaves you with a nice edge similar to that of your cast on. And click this video that's on your screen now to find out how to do that when you're ready to cast off. Until then, keep on knitting, keep on practicing. Make sure you hit subscribe and the little bell icon so you get a notification on our next video, and just enjoy. Happy knitting. Thank you very much.